advisory board for legal operators. Really excited for this conversation. Colin pinged me about a month ago, asked me if I'd want to be a part of it, and I jumped all over it. In particular, because I've worked with both of these gentlemen for about 6.5 years during my tenure at Axiom. So let me just do a quick intros, and then we'll turn it over to do the discussion. But Alec Guettel, who is the current CFO at Knowable, was a Stanford Business School grad and what I would call the most serial entrepreneur that I have ever known in my life, and is on at least his second, if not his seventh home run with Knowable. And Mark Harris, who is the CEO at Knowable, former founder and CEO of Axiom. And Mark, I don't know if you remember this, but you were the last interview that I had in my interview slate at Axiom. I was coming in as a lawyer, and they were like, "Hey, this guy thinks he wants to work here. Can you check him out?" And we had a 90-minute intense conversation, which it had a huge impact on my career. So, really excited to have both of you here to learn a little bit about your journey as entrepreneurs in the legal industry. A little bit about the bridge from Axiom to Knowable, and then we'll certainly dig into what you guys are trying to solve at Knowable.
Sounds good. Well, I'm glad I didn't scare you off, actually. Good years together. Anyway, we're happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We're just happy there are legal operators. We've been in this for so long. Legal operators weren't even a thing when we started, and there was nobody who had an expectation to innovate, and a lot of part that made our lives a lot harder back then. So this is our favorite population. So very happy to be invited to do this.
Awesome.
Perfect. Legal operators and legal tech wasn't even around when you guys started, right? So I'll jump in with that question, right? What was your guys' vision when you came together, many years ago to kind of think about Axiom and the space? Like we had this kind of archaic way of doing things, and you guys have been kind of the original disruptors before legal operations existed, before legal tech got its foothold. Can you tell us a bit about that journey and what you were thinking about at the time, and where you came from the beginning?
Sure. Mark, you want me to kick us off?
We're the OD. Which is even nastier than OG.
That's right.
The original disruptors. I love that. Go ahead, Alec. You start us off.
All right. I feel like you're going to do plenty of talk. I got to get my licks in early. So
exactly.
I know that.
I think I'm going to let you lead, but we both know I'm going to talk more.
Great. So, Colin, Mark and I started talking about what became Axiom in 1999. So I was a sort of a startup guy. I'd come from business school. I'd worked in some startups. Mark was a junior lawyer at Davis Polk, big New York City law firm. We knew each other socially. And Mark actually asked me out to breakfast. And he literally started by drawing on a napkin because we like to embody really extreme cliches anytime we can. This was our first opportunity to do that. And he was, was very much focused on the problem and laying out the economics of a law firm. So he was, he's like, this is what I bill my clients. This is what I get paid. This is what the cost structure looks like. This is what the profit margins look like. And my first reaction to that was that he was probably wrong because, just my understanding of economics didn't really allow for that could be a sustainable economic model in a free market with thousands of competing law firms. It just didn't seem sustainable. But he was getting me all fired up about it. And he really focused on two things, which I think became really central to kind of where we went with Axiom. The first was that law was an entirely information-based industry that had at the time almost no information technology, and that felt like an opportunity. And the second thing was that it was an entirely talent-driven industry, and all the talent that both of us knew was somewhere on the misery spectrum. And that didn't seem sustainable either. And so, he sort of talked me into this conviction of inevitability. And I think that was the real feeling that we had during that first period. We spent about 6 months, we probably met with 100 people just to kind of talk about our ideas and try to refine them. That all just kind of reinforced the sense that we might not be the people who do it, but inevitably someone is going to create an alternative talent model that makes more economic sense. That has to happen. And I think that sense of inevitability is a lot of what's driving us with Knowable too, but that's, we'll get to that later. But that's kind of where we started from, and was that there had to be a better way to put these pieces together, that it might not be that hard to figure that out. And on the basis of that, we raised venture capital, and then we suffered 3 years of horrible agony trying to actually make something happen. Is what happened next.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, during that breakfast, Alec asked a question that only a non-lawyer could ask, which was, why is everyone in this industry so miserable? You know, and I think not that it didn't occur to us that we were miserable. We were just wallowing in our misery instead of asking ourselves why. And the truth was that if you looked at both sides of the exchange, you know, almost universally, clients were really unhappy with the expense and inefficiency of their law firms. But I didn't know any lawyers inside of the law firms that felt like they were underworked or overpaid. And so our premise was, you know, when you have two parties to an exchange and both of them are leaving that exchange unhappy, you know, that's probably a bad exchange. You know, if only one of them was leaving unhappy, that's a bad bargain. But when both leave unhappy, there's something wrong with the actual, you know, the interaction itself. And that's what we wanted to kind of peel apart. You know, we didn't really know what the answers were. And I think in many ways with Knowable, I think we have a pretty strong hypothesis on what the answers are. But what drew us to Knowable is kind of what drew us to Axiom, which is, you know, we're problem obsessed. You know, we see a big problem that we feel like that problem has to get solved. You know, it's not a choice. It's inevitable.
To kind of jump in there, Mark, like you're problem obsessed. Like, so when you've seen the Axiom model first, like you've identified a problem, what was the kind of catalyst for you guys to go out to the market and say, hey, we're going to change things up here? And, you know, how is that going to transfer to what you're doing with Knowable right now? That mindset, you know, like, was it first to approach companies, get the information, and then, you know, come in to solve it, get a few use cases? Like, what is your process?
The process for actually kind of driving adoption.
Yeah, for making it happen, right? So, like, yeah. I'm trying to get into your mindset at the time because we all know the outcome of it, right? So, yeah, what is the like? When did you take the gloves off and say, "Hey, we're in with 6 companies here. We've got a model that works." You know, let's scale it.
Well, as Alec said, it took quite a while, actually. You know, because the reality is with new categories, new ideas, and especially new categories, it's just you're fighting a ton of inertia. And, you know, particularly in the legal industry, which is a generally fairly change resistant industry, a lot of aversion to risk, not a lot of incentives to try new things or to experiment. That's changed quite a bit thanks to, you know, the sort of COO, the office of the chief operating officer in the law department, and just generally, you know, law departments catching up with the rest of, you know, business. But I think our thing was, you know, Alec's instinct right away was, you know, because we were building infrastructure, we were building enabling technology, you know, all this stuff. And his instinct was, we just have to get business right away. Like, let's just go talk to customers. And so that's what we started doing. It's difficult to go talk to customers when you don't have a fully built out solution. And so you end up in a bit of a chicken and egg kind of dilemma, particularly with the kind of business we had, which was effectively what we built across time. The sort of mainstay of Axiom was the talent marketplace. And with any marketplace kind of business, you know, whether it's eBay or Fiverr or Upwork or whatever, you've got a chicken and egg problem. You know, who do you get first? Do you get the customer first, or do you get do you get the sort of the sellers first? In our case, the talent. And you know, we kind of went the customer route. We cobbled together the best we could, kind of a very initial, sort of very small curated network of freelance lawyers. But mostly we went out and we just talked to customers about kind of the problem as we saw it, the gap in the marketplace. You know, you had really 2 sort of options at the time. You could either go to a law firm, which was perfectly elastic, had all the benefits of outsourcing, but extremely expensive and, you know, laden with overhead and pyramidal leverage and, you know, all this stuff that just made the economics kind of difficult. The alternative to that, the only sort of viable alternative for quality sort of legal support was to build up your own in-house department, which had all kinds of things about it that made perfect sense. I mean, you got really experienced senior lawyers. They were totally integrated with the business. They operated much more efficiently. Sort of, we like to think of it as kind of like when you get to a certain level of seniority, you're not too senior inside of a law firm. There's this sort of this section we used to refer to as the value strip. And a lot of those people were kind of peeled out of the law firm environment, stuck in the in-house environment. And that was a really good equation for companies. The problem with it is just it's totally inelastic, and legal needs don't come in a perfectly kind of predictable way. They don't come exactly in the size and shape or in the sort of substantive area that you want them to or expect them to year after year. And so there needed to be a solution that blended sort of the value proposition of in-house counsel with the elasticity of an outsourced provider of a law firm. And we just felt we could kind of, we could there was a big gap there, and that was an opportunity to create a third way or a third category that would be really appealing to large companies.
And meanwhile, no one bought it.
We went out and told.
Right.
I was
going
to
bought
say,
it for years.
Yeah. Was the sell when you went out there first? Because I imagine this was like monstrous change management effort, right? You're getting people to think differently about the whole space.
Yeah.
Like what was that journey?
We had almost every meeting. We hustled for meetings nonstop, which is what you do in a startup. And most meetings went the same way, which was people would say, "Oh yes, exact. I've had this same idea. This is definitely going to happen. Come back when you're all grown up and you have other clients." Yeah. That's what we heard. We heard that for 3 years, and it's just not to gloss over it. When we had our first profitable month, which was April of 2003, we'll never forget it. We had one payroll in the bank. That's how close to the bottom we got. And just for the record, and Akshay knows this, we took our $1,000 profit that month and we rented a van and we drove our whole company, which was like 7 people, down to Atlantic City, and we spent our $1,000 to celebrate. But it was very hard to, you just had to, I think in legal, to innovate, you have to be very patient and you have to be disciplined, which I think is one of Mark's great strengths. Is like, I tend to chase revenue, as he already mentioned. He's really good at identifying, like, this is the thing that matters. This is the territory we want to own. We're going to tell this story again and again and again and again. And you really need that to break into the kind of, the mass market in legal.
Perfect. I want to fast forward on your journey just a little bit more. So when you're in Axiom and things are humming, the machine is humming. I'm reading somewhere recently that you were in half of the Fortune 1000 companies. Like, that's some journey from like being at the bottom with one payroll in there to ruling the world of where you're at, right? It's like, it's quite remarkable. What insights and data did you see in that journey to get you to the point where, hey, I'm looking at this company, Knowable, right? Like, what was the mindset where you're like, hey, I see a gap in the market for this product or service?
Yeah. Well, Axiom ended up, you want me to take that out?
Yeah.
Axiom ended up doing, a few different things. And one of the great sort of strength of Axiom was the relationships that we built with in-house counsel. And we had this unfair advantage because we had these really dynamic, compelling, interesting lawyers that were part of our, talent platform, operating on a freelance basis. And a lot of them actually would spend meaningful time on site with the client. And so we had a license to sort of just show up at the client site, ride the elevators, roam halls. And because of that, we just got to know so many people inside these law departments and built real relationships and friendships and, and engaged with them and problem solved with them and brainstormed with them about stuff that they were wrestling with. So we had kind of next level customer intelligence and visibility into what departments were struggling with. And we also benefited from, that intimacy gave us this opportunity to build relationships. And when you build relationships, then you have trust. And so we became this kind of trusted problem solver or innovator. So when they had things where they didn't have an easy or neat answer, they would come to us and ask us, can you help us fix this? The trick, when you're kind of running and building a company is not to get pulled into every last thing, because you got to stay, as Alec said, you got to stay really focused and know kind of what you're good at. But we did start to get into some other things. And so ultimately, when we sold Axiom in 2019, just before that, there were really two kind of distinct businesses. There was a talent platform and what was called the contracts platform. We spun the contracts platform out of the business. It was about a little less than 100 million in sales, represented about 25% of Axiom's revenue. The contracts platform that we spun out then split into two companies. One is called Factor, which does kind of large scale contracts outsourcing and big remediation projects, and the other became Knowable, which we sold into a joint venture with LexisNexis. Alec and I obviously are running that today. But if you looked at that, so that was 25% of Axiom, totally dedicated to contracts technology, contracts data. But if you looked at the talent platform, which was the other 75%, the great majority of those engagements had to do with the sort of negotiation and execution of contracts. So you put all of that together, we were really around the contracting function for most of the 20-year Axiom adventure in a really substantial way. We spent a lot of times with heads of contracting, a lot of times with people all around that team, a lot of times with the general counsel or the CEO of the law department wrestling with their contracting function. And we had a pretty good feel for kind of what the problem set was and how this thing needed to evolve the next 10 years. And when we spun out, Knowable, Alec and I were working to help kind of, market the company so it could find its next financial partner and find its own sea legs as an independent company. And we just totally fell in love with both with the sort of differentiated capabilities the company had, but more importantly, just the big audacious problem that the company was kind of engineered to solve. And ultimately, we kind of couldn't resist it, and we got back into business together around Knowable.
Perfect. Well, let's talk a little bit about that problem, because I think that's a real good segue. The journey, what you learned along the journey at Axiom, and you've decided to tackle something in the contracting ecosystem, which is somewhat unique. So talk a little bit about kind of the unique nature of the problem that you're trying to address. We can talk about the scale, both from the existing market provider side, but also from the client side, right? Where do clients get it wrong? So we can leave it a little bit open-ended, but would love to start with kind of like, where did you zero in on the problem in this ecosystem that you really wanted to solve, and how do you think about that problem?
You want me to take that one, Mark?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so just to connect it to the kind of the story that Mark was telling, is while we were at Axiom, we would occasionally be recruited by clients to solve a problem that had to do with visibility into their contracts. They were doing a transaction, they had a regulatory issue come up, and they realized they didn't know information that they needed that was in their contracts. And that's how we began to get visibility into this kind of problem space. And at the headline level, the problem sets up in a pretty simple way, which is that data is really important in business. That's like one of the great, that's what the last 10 years have all been about. Contract data is arguably the most important data in the entire enterprise. What's in your contracts is what governs your relationship with every single customer, every single supplier, every employee. All that information is in your contracts, and companies somehow don't have any of that data. It's completely opaque. 80% of them have trouble just finding their contracts. They're not organized into families and the bits and pieces. There's no reliable metadata in almost any company about contracts. And so there's this landscape of data in the enterprise. And then there's this huge blind spot right where the most important data is. And sort of the observation was, there's no way that sustains itself. There's no way 5 to 10 years from now, companies, the biggest companies in the world, have no idea what they've agreed to with their counterparties, what their obligations are, what their entitlements are. There's no way that sustains itself. So that's kind of how we saw the problem, and was kind of the motivation to, let's go do this, because we might be in a good position to help kind of lead that change, as we know it's going to happen over the next 5 or 10 years. So that's kind of, I can take it out of the abstract a little bit, which might be good. So Colin, we could use that.
But before you do that, I'll just add one thing, which is,
and
this is the interesting journey, I think, of kind of company building and category creation, which is, as Alex said, we started with this kind of just both like falling in love with the problem of companies don't know what they've agreed to across tens, if not hundreds of thousands of agreements. And actually all that information is just wildly powerful and valuable and mission critical and everything else. So that can't actually sustain itself. Eventually somebody's going to have to solve that problem. Why not us? But then as we kind of got into the business, you sort of allow yourself to follow the problem set the way that it presents itself. And there was an even more fundamental problem, a threshold problem, which was not only did companies not actually know what they'd agreed to across tens, if not hundreds of thousands of agreements, they couldn't find the agreements to begin with. And if they did find them, they weren't particularly well, organized. They weren't put together with their families, organized with all their related parts, or they'd finally find the contract. There's 6 versions of it. So which one's the execution copy? And so Alec will take you through that now. But then we became obsessed with that problem, which is, it turns out, and not to spoiler alert, but that these very basic problems around finding agreements, kind of connecting them, their related parts so that you can see the whole family, finding information within agreements, knowing basic things about them, those are all data problems, as it turns out. So we became obsessed with that problem set. But go ahead, Alec.
Yeah, I think that's a good setup. And this slide is usually a build for those of you watching this, so it's supposed to look really complicated.
Can you put it in slideshow?
You can. I don't think you can do that. But anyway, it's supposed to look complicated, and it is. But here, the point of it is that there's a custodian of contracts in the enterprise. Usually, that's the law department. They get questions every day about their contracts. Can I sell this product to this customer in this jurisdiction? Do we get a credit because this supplier blew their SLA? Where do we have to remediate to comply with this new data privacy regulation? Just this constant flow of things. And our bigger clients get tens of thousands of questions every year. And this is not a small issue. In the best case, when that happens, you find an efficient way through this incredible workflow, right? It's like I could find the MSA. It was where it was supposed to be. There was only one copy. It was signed by both parties, which was a miracle. You happen to know there are no amendments. You read the document, you figure out the answer, you respond, it takes 15 minutes. Now, it'd be better if you had metadata where you could keystroke answer a question, but okay, 15 minutes, we can live with that. Turns out, for most people in most companies who are custodian of contracts who get these questions, it looks nothing like that most of the time. The MSA isn't in the repository, or there are 3 copies, and none of them are fully executed, and you're not sure which one you're supposed to look at. You could find 4 amendments somewhere in the repository, but you're pretty sure there are more. And 2 of the amendments are in Portuguese, and people end up emailing the person they think negotiated with this counterparty most recently. Then she left the company 2 years ago. It's just this endless series of steps that just feels like wasted time to people. One thing that happens in such a high percentage of our client meetings is clients sort of sheepishly saying, a lot of times we end up going to the counterparty to find the contract. And we hear that all the time. And I think they all think it's just them. And it just cracks us up, because what are the chances the counterparty can find it, given the conversations we're having in the market? But, it's and the cost of this, it can go on for weeks. It can be hard. Sometimes questions don't even get answered. So there are kind of 3 levels of the what that pain causes. First is it's expensive. I mean, we've done some time in motion with some of our bigger clients, many millions of dollars a year just in wasted effort trying to run this stuff down. Second thing is it's a reputational problem, because for a lot of the enterprise, this is the primary way they interact with the law department. And it just doesn't reflect well. And I think it kind of adds to some of the reputational issues that law departments have had and are sort of starting to overcome by using technology. And then the biggest and most important is that it's a real risk problem, because you're missing things, but more importantly, you're training the enterprise not to ask these kinds of questions and to try to sort of wing it. So anyway, we see this, which is not to oversimplify how, what it's like to solve it. I mean, there's a reason that it's not that easy to solve this problem, but companies often feel like they're the only ones in this situation where it's such a mess. And actually it's definitely the majority of companies who this is what they face.
Well, and if you actually, I think it may be the next page, if you just if we want the help of another visual. Fundamentally, the reason it becomes a circus act trying to sort of answer basic questions about, about sort of your contracts is because all the efforts to automate this sort of task of managing your executed agreements and just managing your contracts generally, thus far have been a real struggle. You can see here, this is a survey from the American Corporate Counsel Association this year, where contracts management technology ranked dead last across all categories of legal tech in terms of utility, and where only 11% of respondents are seeing some benefit, from that, from contracts management technology. And then if you go to the next, I think there's another one of these. This is sort of predominantly a story about the CLM experience. CLM standing for Contract Lifecycle Management, which is really the dominant player, as I think most of you guys, most of the sort of audience knows, in the contracts management technology space. 85% of companies that have deployed a CLM are defaulting to manual workarounds. Only 33% of CLMs get fully implemented. Only 18% of CLM users self-report success. There's obviously something like deeply systemic kind of happening here in the space and the experience with, the companies have had in trying to actually get their arms around this problem. And so it just, for people like Alec and myself, this is where it gets really interesting, because it begs this question that has to get answered. Like, what's going on? It's not like this is bad technology, or these are bad companies or any of that. It's like perfectly good technology. There's a perfectly good rationale for having it. It could be incredibly useful if it worked, but there's something happening here that is, sort of threshold and fundamental that obviously isn't working. And so that's the kind of problem that, we get excited about and rally around and want to stick our heads into and go deep on. And that's what kind of, Knowable is sort of here long-term to kind of help companies, get really valuable insights and advanced analytics and, and access to all this really important information and, sort of a better understanding of what you've agreed to across tens of thousands of agreements. But I think in the near medium term, we're here to, as a sort of foundation for that journey, is to really work on this problem and help companies solve it, help CLMs get better, all of that.
Thanks, Mark. So let's talk about it from the angle of kind of the client side there, the company side of the equation a little bit. Certainly markets, problems exist. What's holding companies back from addressing this? Is it just the scale of the problem, as you alluded to earlier? Is it lack of awareness, know-how, all of the above? Like, what are some of the things that you've heard in your client conversations around? Nothing you've shared is particularly like, hey, this makes a lot of sense. Yes, we understand. Why don't clients do more about it or do anything about it?
I don't think it's that they don't care enough about it or that they're not working hard enough on it. I think there have been very earnest efforts here to try to solve this problem across the last decade, solve the problem broadly around contracts management, which, by the way, is, it goes beyond just being able to answer questions about what you've agreed to or get access to information across the sort of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of agreements that you've entered into. But basically, most companies have been trying to tackle that for the last decade. The problem, the fundamental problem is that there are really two distinct parts to contracts management. There's the processing of the next new agreement, and then there's the management of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of executed agreements. The former, the processing of the next new agreement, is a one contract, one agreement at a time exercise. And it lends itself to a workflow technology tool that basically is built around Microsoft Word, because lawyers work in Word. So that makes total sense. We call those text-based tools. But fundamentally, they're architected and engineered around Microsoft Word and workflow. That kind of tooling and technology, and the kind of the sort of the process and other capabilities that you create in order to optimize the processing of new agreements are a complete misfit for the challenge of managing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of executed agreements, which requires a different kind of technology architecture, not a workflow architecture, it's a database architecture, and a different set of tooling, not a text-based tool, but a bunch of purpose-built data management capabilities and tooling. And so just right from the outset, we have a really fundamental sort of disconnect, and I think misunderstanding in the marketplace, having sort of conflated these two very different challenges into sort of lump them into one category called contracts management. And we're probably spending too much time on the processing of new agreements challenge. At any one time, at any sort of snapshot in time, rather, executed agreements, control 90% of your revenue, 90% of your costs, 90% of your risk. So by comparison, the processing of new agreements, is a much smaller sort of percentage or fraction of your overall contracts management challenge. So I think we probably, as an industry, we've over-indexed to, new agreement processing at the expense of managing executed agreements. The real, the real kicker to that whole thing, by the way, is yes, executed agreements represent 90% of your universe at any one time. But they also inform probably 2/3 or more of your new agreement negotiations, because most new agreement negotiations tie back to some existing customer, existing contract, or very similar sort of situation where at least you need to sort of reference it from a precedential standpoint. So, I think the very first thing, my answer, and it's, I want to stop myself, but the very first thing is to understand that these are two different things, and to take a step back and look at kind of which is the most important thing to kind of master first. And then what capabilities and approach do you need to have, understanding that that's a fundamentally different challenge.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of background noise back here. Apologies for that. So let's maybe switch gears a little bit, and talk a little bit, outside of the problem that you're trying to address, and more around kind of how you're going about addressing it. And we can maybe talk about why you chose to address, this avenue within the contracts ecosystem, relative to a CLM tool or repository or workflow tool. Like, why this particular analytics and data piece?
Well, Alec, jump in, and because I'm going to start doing what we both predicted I would do, which is do more of the talking. But I would go back. I just go back. I sort of hinted to this before, but again, we got into this because we knew that contracts were arguably the most valuable, powerful data set in the enterprise. And yet all that data was buried in this Shakespearean prose, and nobody had access to it. And we said, that's inevitable. Somebody's gonna have to solve that problem, right? So we took that lens into this sort of space. But as it turns out, you can't step onto that journey of getting deeper data, getting advanced analytics, getting deeper insights into what you've agreed to across your, contracts corpus, until you have established a foundation of organization and order in your executed agreements. You also really can't actually tackle your new agreement processing and optimize that side of contracts management until you've mastered your executed agreements. And by mastering, I mean just basic order and organization. And for us, that really comes down to just a few very simple things: being able to find your agreements, being able to find information within your agreements using sort of search and maybe a little bit of limited filtering, being able to connect agreement families. So all the related parts, all the ancillary agreements are connected up to the primary agreement, the master, et cetera. But you've got all the amendments, statements of works, everything's there in one family record. And then knowing really basic threshold things about your agreements that you have to know every single time a question comes up, like, is this agreement active or not? You know? So there's just these really basic, simple things that kind of, for us, create the foundation of order and organization in your executed agreements. Turns out that's a data problem. You know, and I can explain more if you want more why that's a data problem, but that turns out to be a data problem. So the capability we're building for sort of, and we have deployed for customers, you know, driving sort of deeper insights and more advanced analytics, is the same kind of raw capability that we feel is required just to establish order and organization. And that's kind of, you know, we see it as a two-part journey, two-step journey. But this first step is, on the one hand, it's kind of in the category of boring but important, but to us, it's fascinating. It's not boring at all. It's kind of, it's kind of the key to the castle when it comes to contracts management, because it's hard to do anything well until you have, you know, created truly a reliable system of record for all the agreements you've already entered into.
Yeah. I would say that's the biggest evolution we've been through so far on this journey, is that when we got into this, we were so excited about the kind of opportunity set that was out there, what you could do with this data. You know, there's real profit potential in this data. Like and this whole theme of defense to offense, which we've talked about offline, I hope we can come back to that. That's a lot of what brought us to this. And so when we first went to market and we're talking to clients about this, a lot of it was about what you could do with this data and the massive potential. But we pretty quickly, people were like, that's great, but you know, I can't even find my like we really needed to step back and create a sort of a first step that was much more sort of bite-sized and manageable. And so that's been probably the biggest evolution in terms of both the product and how we've gone to market. And that's been super helpful. And we've kind of learned a lot from that as well. And I think it really sets up you asked about kind of the why we focus where we focus. One of the things is it's a lot easier than CLM. You know, to Mark's point, CLM, there's a lot of behavior change required. It's a workflow, and often it's with sales. Those are very hard cats to herd. And so those processes are 18, 24 months. And that's really hard. It's a lot easier to go to market with something that's like, hey, we can solve this problem for you. We start narrow. We can do this in a couple months. It's not going to cost 7 figures or anything like, it's just it's a much more comfortable way to kind of get the flywheel turning.
You know, it actually leads into really nicely into a question that was asked by Morgan Smith, which is that in your conversations or in your work, have you come across, or are you able to determine where a CLM implementation has gone wrong or has been unsuccessful versus people and lawyers, contracts managers who simply just dislike the process?
Yeah, and Mark, you can comment on this too, but I'm not sure that matters. You're not getting lift either way. If the reason is because people don't want to change their behavior, it's still failing, right? So we really want to go to market with a solution that doesn't require people to change the stuff that they're doing, that they're really good at, that's their day job, and requires them to, and so I think a lot of solutions around this contract data a lot of companies have started with, well, they'll populate this data. We'll find a way for them to put it somewhere. And that hasn't worked very predictably. So, I'm not sure where I actually think a lot of it is exactly what Morgan's saying, which is behavioral. It's not about the technology not working. It's about people not, people attriting from the process that's been set out.
Yeah. But I think Morgan, I think is actually focused on a really important point because I think it's with any technology deployment, you're going to have some level of frustration and, sociological challenge and all of that. And so we thought a lot about that. There are ways to really mitigate that. And that was the other point Alec was making. But I think that I would bring it back to answer Morgan's question to just start with the most basic things. You want to be able to get out of your contracts management technology. You want to be able to find your agreements. You want to be able to find information within them. So you want a search capability that works. You want to make sure that you're able to connect related parts, ancillary agreements to the primary, so you see the whole family. If you're not, let me just pause on families for a minute. We work pretty much exclusively with large enterprise. Okay. In large enterprise, the great majority of contracts are made up of multi-agreement families. Very rarely is it sort of single contract, single MSAs, standalone MSAs. So the majority of contracts are made up of multiple agreement families. That family is a single contract. So if you're not seeing the whole family, if you're not seeing all of the related parts, you're not seeing the whole contract. So you can't answer a question about the contract. You can't answer a question about the contract responsibly. So, okay. So that just brings me back to my list. Find agreements, find information within agreements, make sure that everything's connected in the family. You can see the whole family, and then know basic threshold things about this contract, like, is it active, inactive, or what is its status generally? Is it about to terminate next 3-6 months? Will it auto renew if we don't do anything? Those sort of basic questions around term, termination, renewal, which we consider to be threshold attributes you have to know. So I would just say, so the question for Morgan is your solution doing that? Is it delivering that? We're out there, we talk to hundreds of customers. We're working with scores of them. We've not come across a customer that has a solution that can do all those things. And it's easy on the surface to say, oh, no, we do that. Well, the tool does it. The tool may, in a demo, may be able to sort of claim that it does it. But is it working in real life? And there are very real reasons why it doesn't work in real life. They're really, from a sort of capability standpoint, there is no tool out there today, no CLM tool that can manage this family problem, that can basically connect and roll up a family record so that you can, at least from a sort of audit trail perspective, visibly, you can see the entire family together and how it has evolved across time. But then the next sort of step is actually the ancillary impact is reflected in the family, so that it all rolls up basically into kind of a notion of a virtual contract. Those things don't exist in the existing kind of capability set that's out in the marketplace today. And that's really the kind of one of the more important sort of flaws of the incumbent approach. Is it's just ignoring that for most companies, 60-70% or more of their contracts are multi-agreement families, and you have to have a way of solving for that.
Perfect. I'm going to jump in now and just going to get focused on your product, some of the use cases, some of the differentiators on Knowable. So some of the questions like to just come to mind is like, you said it's a data problem. It's about finding your data rapidly, really quickly, just having access to all the different parent-child agreements. I'd imagine every now and again the regulator comes calling, and this question is for the three of you guys. What is some of the use cases where Knowable kind of sets you apart, and like finding your documents if somebody says, hey, we need to find X amount of contracts, we're in a litigation, let's get the ball rolling. Question goes out to Aksha. I know that you're in-house. You might see this. I've seen this.
I can set up
some of the things you've seen.
I'm happy to set up kind of just one of the use cases. I work at a very heavily regulated company, so we have a lot of people poking around and asking us questions. Many of the answers to those questions lie in our agreements. So at the scale at which we operate, that is a particular pain point, and how you get to that information. Where is it readily available? Can you find it? Let's just start with, can you find it? And then, is it readily available? How quickly can you analyze it and have something to give back? That's just one particular use case at a pain point for a heavily regulated company.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. And I think the sort of framework to see it through for, we see everything in this kind of two-stage process, right? So we have a product called Essentials. That's the entry level. Let's get our organized, everything's searchable. It's all in one place. It's in families. It's the entry level. And so the use cases for that are really more defensive, about just good hygiene, just being able to execute as a law department, answer basic questions, do your job more quickly and efficiently, save money. Okay. The other side we call exponentials, and that's the kind of stuff that Akshay is talking about, where you're now drilling deeper into the data to support other kinds of use cases. And some of them are regulatory compliance. There's a lot around that. There's a lot around, people are putting so much effort and energy into creating policies and creating playbooks. They have no idea what's happening after they release the playbook. Have they actually complied with that? Where are they not complying? Where is Europe complying, but North America is not? Is this business? So all that data is in your contracts. But maybe most exciting in this kind of exponentials area are the use cases around revenue and cost and profit, right? So, historically, and this goes back to this defense to offense thing, the general counsel reporting to the board, it's about risk and cost. It's like decades of going to conferences and like, we're being asked to do more with less. All of that is sort of this defensive mindset, right? And in the boardroom, they're talking about, this is our strategic agenda. They're talking about, we have a profit shortfall this quarter. And there's just never been a role for the law department in trying to put points on that board. And this is where we think data can be that pivot point. So on the revenue side, it's like, okay, we're going to miss our Q4 revenue number. Everybody else in the enterprise is running around trying to solve that. Nobody in the law department, it's just not their problem. With this kind of data, you can say, hey, okay, our 2,000 biggest customers, these 250, we can raise prices today. Okay, most of them you can't raise prices because it's not till the agreement comes up for renewal. But for whatever reason, these 250 have different rules. You could raise those prices tomorrow. That could be millions of dollars of revenue, tens of millions of dollars, right? And there's 1,000 of those things, and they exist on the cost side just as much. And nobody's yet, there are very few companies and a few that we work with that are just being able to really explore just the outlines of those opportunities. And it's a completely different mindset for the law department. So that's really motivating for us, but it can be a bit of a distraction. And we spend a lot of time telling clients like, hey, let's just get our stuff together first, and then we'll start prioritizing the highest ROI uses of data. But first, we're just going to do the essentials. So that's kind of how the product set evolves and what the use cases are.
Do you want to jump in, Mark?
I think I could illustrate that sort of stepwise build through the lens of data accuracy, which is really kind of at the sort of core of your question and the hypothetical that you presented, Akshay, which is, what do we have? Can we find it? Where are we? Let's do an initial assessment and diagnose, and then we'll figure out kind of what actions we need to take. Colin, could you pull up there's a page that says data accuracy on it, I think, or maybe the next page. Before that one, I think. Yeah, there you go. So if you think of the stepwise journey, again, there's contracts management, right? There's new agreement processing. Then there's the management of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of executed agreements. For the management of executed agreements, every company needs to have a reliable, searchable, digitized system of record. Once that's in place, that's the foundation. You can then move and migrate to a system of intelligence. And that's what Alec is describing. You can deploy the system of intelligence for not just defense, but for offense, right? Revenue optimization, margin optimization, cost optimization. You can also deploy the system of intelligence, Akshay, for more advanced defense. Regulators are poking around. We need to look at a whole portfolio of our agreements and look at and figure out what our sort of systemic level of risk is, that kind of thing. If you're going to have a system of record, there's sort of two things you have to have. You have to have really good data, and then you've got to have a tool that is sort of built to do the things that you need it to do. Starting with those four basic things that I mentioned before, right? Finding agreements, connecting with families, et cetera. So So we could spend an hour talking about data at least, but if I had to sort of leave the audience with one thing, it would be this, which is how absolutely critical it is to have near perfect accuracy in your data. So if you start over here on the right, there's a column here that says fingerprint. Okay. The simplest, most basic things we'll ever ask technology to do when it comes to contracts management are represented in this fingerprint. That's find an agreement. The document repositories that come with the CLM are perfectly fine places to store agreements, but they can be pretty difficult places to retrieve agreements, actually find them when you need them, even if they're in there in the first place. And so the algorithm, the software has to actually identify this agreement among a population of, 50,000, 150,000, 500,000, et cetera. It's got to find it, retrieve it. The other reason you need to be able to sort of identify an agreement, have a fingerprint, is so that you're connecting it appropriately with its related parts, so that it's sitting in the right family. When we ask software to do something, it does it the same way a human being would do it, right? It just does it at scale. It can do it much more efficiently, much more accurately, but it does it the same way. You're replicating human steps. So when a human being goes to identify an agreement, it looks at information within the agreement. And there are 4 fundamental pieces of data that you need to identify agreement. You need to know the party, the counterparty, the agreement type, and the effective date. That for us forms the fingerprint of an agreement. But what's interesting about that is that's not just one data point. That's 4 data points. And so if you have 90% data accuracy, whether you're using machine learning or AI or some technology only tool, or whether you're using people in India or people on your own team to input that data, if you have 90% accuracy, you factor that across 4 sort of separate, distinct data points. Now you have 65% accuracy. So that means every time the algorithm goes to find or identify a contract, 1 out of 3 times it's serving up the wrong answer, which right away, to Morgan's point, creates a sociological challenge because people are pulling their hair out because they're seeing wrong information all the time. But if you go back to something I harped on before, which is the great majority of contracts are made up of multi-agreement families. Any family that has 3 or more agreements in it is going to be statistically wrong. And so then so now we're in the middle column of families. Now, any family that has at least 3 agreements is statistically wrong. That's creating all sorts of problems and inefficiency in time and pulling our hair out. Now you want to zoom out, and you're at Facebook or somewhere else, and you want to look at a whole portfolio of agreements, like an entire segment or a population or geography or whatever. Most of those records are going to be wrong. And it all stems from this root cause you have to have near perfect data in order to perform these basic, most fundamental contracts management tasks. And if you don't have that, the whole sweater starts to unravel. And so this is why this foundation on a stepwise journey is so important. Everybody's excited about getting to the portfolio level looks into our obligations, our entitlements, our exposure. Give me the advanced analytics, blow me away with that stuff. But you have to have that foundation first. And you have to have that foundation just to be able to run your company, just to be able to respond to the tens of thousands of questions that come up, just to be able to actually negotiate new agreements in a way that's sensible and connected with what you've already agreed to with that customer or a similar customer. So anyway, I'll stop.
It's actually a good segue into the last kind of portion of this, which is, if you were to give some advice to the folks who are on the call today and out into the industry who are grappling with CLMs, contracting, data, questions back to the business, to regulators, whatever those use cases may be, it sounds to me like the best piece of advice is you have to address this upstream issue first before you start getting to the other stuff.
Yeah, I think, Colin, if you go to the last page, there's a sort of mountain metaphor page. That one, yeah. I mean, Alec, you should overrule me here, but I think the number one piece of advice I would give if I'm, talking to somebody who's grappling with this and they're really kind of either a lot of these problems we've talked to are really resonating, or they're at the outset and they're trying to put the puzzle together, is to start with executed agreements. I mean, it's hard to make anything work in your contracts ecosystem until you have your arms around your executed agreements. The other good news about executed agreements is putting that reliable, digitized, fully searchable system of record in place is, to a point Alec made earlier, that can be done in 3 months. That's an implementation sort of that can take weeks or months, not multiple years. So it's a great way to put runs on the board. It's a great way to sort of make people happy quickly, but it's also the threshold step to doing anything else, whether you want to go further on the kind of data journey or whether you just want to make your CLMs work. What you can see here on this sort of diagram is that a lot of companies we work with, because we work with large enterprise, they have multiple CLMs. They have one for sales, they have one for procurement. That makes sense because there are tools that grew up becoming sales tools. Aptus, for instance, is a quote to cash tool. It's even bigger than a contracting tool. It's a whole revenue focused workflow. Icertis is more of a vendor focused procurement based tool. So you might have different tools that do different things really well because those workflows look really different. They're supporting business processes that are different. Maybe you acquired a tool or you've got a homegrown tool or what have you, but most of our customers have multiple workflow tools and we don't see any problem with that. Workflow looks different across these really large enterprises. And so trying to get people to conform how they do their work so that you can make a technology tool function is not super realistic. I think the workflow tool should follow the workflow. But what needs to happen is that they need to flow into one place, and that place needs to be really dependable, needs to be reliable, needs to be accurate, needs to be searchable, needs to sort of be built on a database architecture so that you have the flexibility to move into the future, all of those things. So I think we would just say, figure out your executed agreement challenge. Even if you have a CLM today, even if you have multiple CLMs today and they're not working perfectly, the minute you get that figured out, you're in a position now to make all those CLMs function at a much higher level. And then you're also in a position to go further on the sort of data journey.
Sorry.
Okay, guys, I don't know whose phone that is. Hello?
That's mine. Apologies.
No, a quick question. I want to answer the questions from the folks we have. That Richard asked the question and David Cleary. So let's answer these questions first.
Sure.
Richard, you guys were the disruptors that made huge inroads into the market. What do you see as the market competition today? Is it law firms, ALSPs, technology, in-house counsel, more savvy clients?
I think that question probably came up when we were still talking about Axiom. I think that was more about Axiom and Knowable. You think that's right, guys?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I don't know. Well, as it relates to Knowable, I mean, to me, it's first, the biggest challenge is misinformation. It's just, there's so much misinformation in the contract space. It's unbelievable. There's a lot of hype around machine learning and AI and other pure technology solutions. So a lot of it is just wading through all the misinformation. It's hard because lawyers aren't technologists, and we're like trying to sort of take what we know and take what we're hearing in demo and put it together and all that stuff. So I think the biggest thing is just sorting through the kind of mess of misinformation and sort of myths that are out there. But if I had to pick a kind of a competitive set, it's probably the idea that a static document repository that is appended to a CLM workflow tool is going to function as your solution for managing your executed agreements. And so we are on a sort of mission here to help companies understand that's not actually going to work for that particular function. So they're probably the closest thing we have, but we actually see ourselves as somebody who can work really well with CLMs and make them a lot better. We're just doing a different job.
Perfect. David, I will follow up with both Alec and Mark with your question, and we try to get an answer for that later on. But we're at the top of the hour, and I did want to ask one more question, if anybody wanted to stay on and if we have some time. We talked about the present, where you're at with Knowable, and the future. We talked about data. We talked about your vision for Axiom. What is your vision for the next like 5 years in this data world we're living in? And, you know, how is Knowable going to help solve that? And if you could leave any takeaways for the audience.
Well, I think number one, we're going to break the back of this contracts management problem sort of finally and hopefully forevermore. That's sort of step one. Is we're going to get organized and orderly around our executed agreements. We're going to, you know, participate hopefully in that journey with customers. But I think if you really go out 5-7 years, you know, Alec likes to say this, I totally agree, is, you know, we'll look back on 2021 with total disbelief that we did not know what we'd agreed to across tens, if not hundreds of thousands of agreements. I mean, it's just the value, the inherent value of that information, the way in which the needs for that information comes up every single day. It's just incredible. I think once people have figured it out and solved for that, that's the more advanced journey. It'll just seem incredible that we operated without that information.
Yeah.
I've got to give you a little quick visual on that. Maybe it's helpful to wrap up. But if the CEO called the CFO today in a company and said, "Well, how's our revenue look for the quarter?" and the CFO said, "Let me just flip through my invoices here and see how they're doing," that wouldn't look too good, you know. And same thing with commercial and Salesforce. In legal, that's what you call the general counsel. That's what the law department has to go do. And I think 5-7 years from now, it's going to be a lot like the rest of the enterprise with access to real-time, accurate data that totally changes the way the whole thing operates.
That's a really good analogy. Yeah.
Fantastic, guys. Look, we went a little bit over. I just want to say to all the attendees, thank you very, very much. Really appreciate your time and spending it with us today. We'll follow up with a copy of the recording, and we hope to have you back next time. Thank you to Aksha. Really appreciate it. Alec, Mark, and our partner to Knowable. We love the team. Do some amazing things in our space. With that, bid you guys farewell and see you next week.
Thanks, Alec and Mark.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you guys. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Hey, we're still here.